Alrighty, recording here for, I guess this is pod 29 at this point, yeah. So my last episode was finishing Plato's Phaedo, which finishes off the sort of trilogy of Euthyphro, Apology, Phaedo as sort of a 3-dialogue trilogy. And then in my anthology that I'm using, which again is the Readings in Ancient Greek Philosophy from Thales to Aristotle, 4th edition, edited by S. Mark Cohen, Patricia Curd, and CDC Reeve. They basically do a bunch of Platonic dialogues in between Phaedo and phaedo, including Meno. But just because it's in the book like that doesn't mean that's the way we need to do it. And so we're going to go through phaedo first. As far as being the next Platonic dialogue I'm going to go through. Now, looking at it really quickly, because I don't want to spend too much time on meta-analysis of how long this is going to take, basically, but we're going from page 267 to 319 in the book, so clearly, we're about, 50-ish pages, so in comparison to Euthyphro, which is about a 10-page dialogue, and Apology is about 12 pages or so. Phaedo is another one of the shorter dialogues, arguably gets right to the point, but this sort of potentially is a difference between what people refer to as early, mid, and late Plato. If we ever get to any late Plato in this sort of page of Plato sort of version of the podcast, then I will have been doing this for quite a long while. Maybe we'll be able to just go through the laws or something like that, which I've never really read myself in full. Is one of the sort of things on my long-term bucket list, sort of reading list, is Plato's The Laws. But much more familiar personally with the early and mid-Plato content, and therefore it's only something to note going from the dialogues we've gone through already. Again, Euthyphro, Apology, Phaedo, and I've raised certain points as far as if you're going to essentially assume that all of these dialogues happened historically speaking. I don't know if there's going to be evidence to refute that, but there's also not the sort of evidence in favor that would solidify, for example, that, Socrates had a conversation with Euthyphro outside of the court, this, that, and the other. The only one that's viewed as completely based on a historical event is obviously the Apology, because kind of no matter your opinions on these matters, it's known that Socrates was put on trial, sentenced or convicted, sentenced to death, and executed by the Athenian democracy. And therefore, with those basic facts not being a matter of dispute, you can take the Apology and, you can cross-compare it with Xenophon's version. And I had actually said before that I hadn't read the Xenophon's Apology at all, and that's not true. I've taken a peek at it on like an internet PDF version, and suffice it to say I wasn't the most impressed with it. I think I have basically the same general impression that everybody seems to have with it, but to sort of get off that point, I think you couldn't say, for something like Phaedo, you could begin to poke holes and say, did this actually happen? Is this a means for hypothetical discussion of conversations that would have happened in some circumstance? You know what I'm saying? We could get down a rabbit hole and waste a lot of time on this, but I think, as I've said before, what we're going to do in this course is just to kind of assume and roll with the punches, as far as we're not, here to pull apart Plato's Phaedo on this one and say, well, that probably didn't happen, or this didn't happen or that's an exaggeration. Because I think the best thing you can get from those sort of things is to sort of make the conclusion that in this sort of mid-Plato dialogue, Plato has essentially started to get more creative, and therefore you just need to put a little less stock in what he says that Socrates said, if you're going to argue that there's some sort of difference between a Platonic and a Socratic ideology. So that's, I think, all that's needed in terms of introducing Plato's Phaedo. But in terms of rationale for having it after Crito, it's because it purportedly represents the events that happened essentially afterwards of the Crito-Socrates conversation, which I don't even necessarily want to peel open to the beginning in Crito, because I do think it's like, oh yeah, you were sleeping. Yeah, it happens just before dawn, so they're talking, very late at night, just before the morning, and then obviously then they were there with him, and then just to give kind of the start of the dialogue, because it's good grounding, so a character named I'm not pronouncing this well, and I'm just going to try once. Echecrates. I'm going to spell that for you. Echecrates. So Crates, like Socrates, and then Echecrates, whatever. I'm not going to be naming him again, so... but he says, were you there with Socrates yourself, Phaedo, on the day when he drank the poison in prison, or did someone else tell you about it? So that's sort of the context. The day when Socrates drank the poison, the hemlock, in prison, and situating them as first-hand, or receiving a first-hand account from a first-hand witness, i.e. Phaedo. So that is sort of the context of that. And before I roll into this, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to start reading Phaedo, and I think a lot of these dialogues are going to have a similar format where there's going to be a good section at the beginning for me to find a lot of stuff to chew on without really diving too deeply into the material of this, because like I said, this is a 50-plus page dialogue, and as I sort of alluded to in Plato's Euthyphro discussions, this is where I think if you're going to make the arguments for Plato laid the intellectual groundwork for the religion that came to be known as Christianity, if you want to make those sort of ideological arguments, you can find a lot of supporting evidence in Plato's Phaedo. And then just in terms of the sort of monumental nature of this dialogue in particular, I think it's worthy of note that I think when you read Descartes, and I think you can find this in, and I'm trying to look over at my library really quickly to see if I can pick out my Descartes book, and oh gosh, my Descartes book is somewhere out and about right now, so I don't know where it is, and it means that I meant to, I just found it. It's lying over there. I'm not even going to pick it up because it's under a pile of other crap, but in that, he writes a letter where he makes very clear reference, I think, to Plato's Phaedo in terms of dialogues concerning the nature of death, the afterlife, and those kinds of considerations. And then I think kind of in the Cartesian tradition, you also have, I think, Immanuel Kant, who placed, I think, a high value on the work of Plato, even though he's fundamentally, I think, against a lot of sort of the Platonic ideology as expressed in a lot of cases, but or he may not be against things point for point, but he has sort of an issue with the overall approach of the Platonic approach. And so but that's just some context to say that Plato's Phaedo is one of the more influential dialogues, even if Timaeus was the one thing that people in the West were reading for hundreds and hundreds of years was kind of their only tap into Plato before the Renaissance and the fall of Constantinople kind of brought the Greek text back into the Western sphere a bit. But this dialogue, I think I would rank it as my personal favorite of all the dialogues, and then competing with it would be Euthyphro, Republic, no doubt. I'm not the biggest Symposium fan, but there's Symposium people who can dive into all. So if we get the Symposium, we'll see that there's not only stuff to chew on, there's so much to chew on, my jaw is going to hurt, essentially. So, I guess, seeing as I'm here reading from my anthology, which, I've been making allusions or directly quoting from some of my my notes in the margins in these books, which, if you don't write in the margins in your books for notes, I would encourage you to do so, because it's a way of capturing your ideas and impressions at the time, sort of a snapshot of where you're at, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not a weight to hold you down, it's a little mark of where you were. But just here on the sort of title page before it begins, and I think I've done this for, I don't know how many of I didn't do this for Crito because it's too short, but I have done this for basically all the other Platonic dialogues in here. And what I've done is I have written a selected sections note at the beginning, which is basically pointing out, not quotes, but lines in the Greek pagination. Remember, it's the Greek pagination, not the page in the book. So, we're on 267 of the book, but when we start reading Plato's Phaedo, it will start at 57 on the Greek pagination. So keep that in context when I say that the selected sections for this book, or not the book, this dialogue, Phaedo, selected sections are 60C, 62B, 63C, 64C through 67B. I guess I also have here 65D, 66A, 66C through D, 67C through D, 68D, 69A, 69B, 69D, 70 through 76, 77B through 79C, 79D through 80B, 80D, 83C. Oh, I also had 79A on there. I don't know why that's not necessary. It's included in the other one, but and then I have a little arrow pointing to 83C, which says, the note says Christianity, so I'm curious enough about that, so I'm going to flip through to 83 real quick to see what, yes. Yeah, so it's really down here at 83D to D to E for the most part in this paragraph. So I'll just read it. Because every pleasure or pain provides, as it were, another nail to rivet the soul to the body and to weld them together, makes the soul corporeal, so that it believes the truth is what the body says it is. As it shares the beliefs and delights of the body, I think it inevitably comes to share its ways and manner of life, and is unable ever to reach Hades in a pure state, is always full of body when it departs, so that it soon falls back into another body, grows with it as if it had been sewed into it. Because of this, it can have no part in the company of the divine, the pure, and the uniform. And actually, that's not even, to say that's Christianity, that's really more a religious ideology overall, that you can say Christianity adapted aspects of those ideas, and that your sins sort of weigh your soul down, and you'll never be able to rejoin in sort of the pure state of being, which is to be with God in an unalienated sense, which you can never be God's equal, but you can, if you're not living in sin, resolve the alienation between yourself and God, and therefore after you die, that sort of will resolve it permanently as long as you had faith, yada, yada, yada. So you can even see, though, in what I just read from Plato, that it's really actually not, it's not quite in line with a Judeo-Christian ideology, essentially that of, in Judaism, it's not exactly as clear what sort of the end game is, as far as messianic traditions and end of the world prophecies and this, that, and the other. I think it's more nebulous and of an open question in that religion, as far as, are the bones really gonna, have their flesh kind of restored to them, and people are going to be restored that way, or is it going to be more of a spiritual? And that's to get very far afield, so I'm realizing it's not necessarily worthwhile to spend the time speculating on that. Just to point out, though, that what he's talking about in terms of like, your sinfulness, your soul sort of gets weighed down in the body and then continues to go from body to body. It's much more in line with the transmigration of souls idea, which to say that Socrates sounds more and more like certain of what I know from my brief brushes understanding of certain bits of Hindu ideology and certain things that are more traditional of Indian philosophy. He seems very much tapped into some of those ways of thinking, like they're thinking the same thing in separate places, coincidentally, arguably, by coming across the concepts from an intellectual perspective. So that's a bit of an introduction there, and we haven't even started reading the dialogue, but I thought all that was good and useful introduction, and we will see how far we get into this dialogue on this page of Plato, because this could literally be, I'm trying to look at this here, though, and the first page or two is actually almost completely irrelevant, and then the first really interesting thing that's said is actually said on page 3 of this, so probably going to whip through to page 3 and then kind of land there and start chewing. But one last thing I wanted to say, though, because I was doing this right before I was reading George R. R. Martin's A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. That's the 3 Dunk and Egg novellas, if you know them by another name, and I'm in the middle, I think, of the second novella. Dunk is about a battle some night in a trial by combat of some kind to resolve a matter about some woman trying to burn down stuff and a dude who rebelled against the crown and yada yada yada. But just to quickly divert from phaedo here a second and say, well done, George R. R. Martin, because I finished the first story and obviously had heard about these, and I'm about to tap into Dance with Dragons, the final Game of Thrones book that's out there right now. But I wanted to read the Dunk and Egg novellas between book 4 and 5. Apparently book 5 is basically just a continuation of book 4 anyway, so I'm going to try to work my way through it. But as somebody who had always been a Game of Thrones fan who never sort of understood the constant allusions to the Blackfire rebellions, and sort of, I had heard about it in like the videos as far as what had happened, but I feel like when you read this series, it really doesn't sink in until you read it, start to get the world sort of painted for you. But as far as, the Baelor Breakspear story with Maekar and Aryan Brightflame and Aegon and Dunk and all these guys, this guy just does a fantastic job in his world creation, and just wanted to quickly mention that before diving back into the content that we are here for, which is Plato's Phaedo. So again, just to say from the beginning, because we're about 20 minutes in, don't know how much of the dialogue we're going to get through this time, because this dialogue is very important. There's a lot of stuff to go over, and it's longer. Frankly, when we get to the Republic, and the Republic is a few hundred pages long, that's going to take a while, and we'll see about that, because, you know, you're going through something like Republic. If you don't slow down at the beginning and give people a good understanding of the concept of going down and what that means in the Greek context, from the Odyssey and from all these things, you know, you're just doing the text a disservice. So, but anyway, to start now, so Plato's Phaedo, starting with, and because I can't pronounce his name correctly and it's going to trip me up every time and I'm going to have to say his name, we're going to call him Ecrates, because I can't say Echecrates. Echecrates. Okay, fine, we'll say Echecrates. Doesn't sound great, but so Echecrates, were you with Socrates yourself, Phaedo, on the day when he drank the poison in prison, or did someone else tell you about it? Phaedo, I was there myself, Echecrates. Echecrates, what are the things he said before he died? And how did he die? I should be glad to hear this. Hardly anyone from Phelus visits Athens nowadays, nor has any stranger come from Athens for some time who could give a clear account of what happened, except that he drank the poison and died, but nothing more. Phaedo, did you not even hear how the trial went? Echecrates, yes, someone did tell us about that, and we wondered that he seems to have died a long time after the trial took place. Why was that, Phaedo? That was by chance, Echecrates. Day before the trial had happened, the prow of the ship that the Athenians send to Delos had been crowned with garlands. What ship is that? It is the ship in which the Athenians say Theseus once sailed to Crete, taking with him 2 lots of 7 victims. He saved them and was saved himself. The Athenians vowed then to Apollo, so the story goes, that if they were saved, they would send a mission to Delos every year. And from that time to this, they send such an annual mission to the god. They have a law to keep the city pure while it lasts, and no execution may take place once the mission has begun, till the ship has made its journey to Delos and returned to Athens. This can sometimes take a long time if the winds delay it. The mission begins when the priest of Apollo crowns the prow of the ship, and this happened. Sorry, a little bit of a thing there. It's just coughing real quick, but so they have a law to keep the city pure while it lasts. No execution may take place once the mission has begun until the ship has made its journey to Delos and returned to Athens. This can sometimes take a long time if the winds delay it. The mission begins when the priest of Apollo crowns the prow of the ship, and this happened, as I say, the day before Socrates' trial. That is why Socrates was in prison a long time between his trial and his execution. So, a couple notes here. First thing to note, like I said in the previous thing, I don't think the Athenians did mass incarceration like we do in our modern society, so they're noting that he was in prison for sort of a unusual amount of time. That, and the other note again, we've got this note about the ship of Theseus, and so the ship of Theseus is, that's not the Argo, which would be the sort of, I think there's either a ship of Theseus or some sort of thought experiment in philosophy about a ship where essentially all the material components of it are replaced over time, and therefore is it the same ship? Is it a different ship? What makes something what it is? And then from there you can basically teach a non-initiated person a sort of Aristotle-style fourfold theory of cause, and then sort of make your distinction between material cause, formal cause, final cause, efficient cause, etc., and point out basically why the ship is not completely new just because on a material basis. So that's interesting to note. And there's just this tradition that the Athenians participate in, part of their legendary history, which, to say this is historically based, again, Theseus, real person, maybe not, are you going to give him credit for all the adventures he theoretically went on, his comings, his goings, where he ends up at the end, all these different things, is he part of the Orestes sort of trilogy, et cetera, et cetera. So these things are obviously legends, but they're legends that are very important, and particularly, you would say it's not just because they're Greeks that they care so much about Theseus, it's particularly because they're Athenians, and so this is why, the Athenians will favor the myths that involve them. So you look at Homer's Iliad, for example, and the Athenians are certainly present. They're mentioned. They're there. They're being led by Menestheus or some dude who, spoiler alert, is not a major character in the story. He's there. He's important. He's leading a decently sized contingent. But at this point in history, Athens was not the capital of Greece as it is in the current period, as you could argue it was during the classical Athenian period, where regardless of whether Greece was a unified state, you would say that the central point of everything going on was centered around the Attica state, with Athens as the biggest city in Greece, the place with the most things going on. You make your arguments along with Socrates as far as the virtue of these people, etc. But what you can't deny is the material culture that they created, and the if not the levels of virtue that they attained, then certainly, to use a loaded term, the levels of sophistication that they reached. Sophistication obviously being a word that's a reference to the sophists, etc. So this is just to say, this is the context of what they're talking about. And so Nicocrates says, what about his actual death, Phaedo? What did he say? What did he do? Who of his friends were with him? Or did the authorities not allow them to be present, and he died with no friends present? Phaedo says, no, by no means. Some were present, in fact, a good many. Nicocrates, please be good enough to tell us all that occurred as fully as possible, unless you have some pressing business. I love that little line where, it's like, what else would you be doing? This is a platonic dialogue. Of course he's not going to be like, well, I've told you enough. Story's over. It's clearly story time, but that's sort of the rhetorical techniques you will see in Plato that kind of make these dialogues flow along and be entertaining. So Phaedo says, I have the time, and I will try to tell you the whole story, for nothing gives me more pleasure than to call Socrates to mind, whether talking about it myself or listening to someone else do so. Your hearers will surely be like you in this, Phaedo, so try to tell us every detail as exactly as you can. So just to flag something real quick that we flagged towards the beginning, again, this is what we will refer to in epistemology terms as testimony, meaning this entire dialogue, as opposed, let's say, to Euthyphro and apology, and flip back here to make sure this is right, but I think Phaedo as well. Yes. So those dialogues are all presented as stories starting in the middle, which I said was a virtue of Plato's. Clearly here in Phaedo, there's a slightly different stylistic tact that we have to be aware of and note, because frankly, not to say it's going to get worse, but it's going to get more extreme. What's going to get more extreme is Plato's going to start having these introductions. And what are the introductions about? Sometimes they're a tangent. Sometimes, like at the beginning of the Republic, it's seemingly a version of a way for Plato to flex his intellectual muscles and be like, yeah, I've read the Odyssey, I've read Homer, which you would say, like, Plato, you didn't need to convince me that you were smart, buddy. I'm here to listen to you talk, not to sort of entertain your rhetorical tactics. But that's just to point out, we've already gotten a page in, and unlike those other dialogues, which, like I said, they're firsthand, starting in the middle of the story, Socrates is the character. Now it's stories about Socrates being related by people after the fact, being related by a person who was there, but, this isn't Crito, right? This is somebody else. So just noting, and this is what you have to do from an epistemological perspective, when somebody tells you things like this, you have to understand, okay, is this, direct evidence? Is this hearsay? How strong is this evidence? And everybody has the ability and the need to intellectually evaluate things like that. And so certain important things are going to come about as a result of this. So I'm not just trying to drag along too, but so what's important to note, though, what you can say about this, not talking about the story for a second, but talking about this as a Platonic dialogue, we can say, oh, well, these dialogues arguably, kind of like Epictetus said, tell us all that occurred as fully as possible, and try and tell us every detail as exactly as you can. And that's where you can argue, oh, well, these dialogues they're not made up. They're relating real things that happened. I think the extreme version of that argument is to say they always did that. I think the stronger argument is to say sometimes that happened, and to make your sort of arguments or when you think it happened and didn't happen. But in this case, again, it's secondhand, meaning, maybe there's a slight bit less of fidelity to what was said, or, as I'm about to go over in a paragraph or two, there's arguably, though, a specific reason in this case why Plato has to go this route. And so I'm just going to continue reading, because it's not going to be in this next paragraph, but a few lines down from that paragraph where we'll hear why this is the case. So Phaedo says, I certainly found being there an astonishing experience, meaning at his death. Although as witnessing the death of one who was my friend, I had no feeling of pity, for the man appeared happy in both manner and words as he died nobly and without fear, Epictetus, so that it struck me that even in going down to the underworld, there we go again, going down to the underworld, he was going with the God's blessing, and that he would fare well when he got there, if anyone ever does. That is why I had no feeling of pity such as would seem natural in my sorrow, nor indeed of pleasure, as we engaged in philosophical discussion as we were accustomed to do, for our arguments were of that sort. But I had a strange feeling, an unaccustomed mixture of pleasure and pain at the same time, as I reflected that he was just about to die. All of us present were affected in much the same way, sometimes laughing, then weeping, especially one of us, Apollodorus. You know the man and his ways. Epictetus, of course I do. So, just to pause on this paragraph real quick, and we haven't even gotten to the point of what I said a minute ago, but so astonishing experience, and then this sort of consistency from point to point. Crito says it, other people will say it. Socrates seemingly was very calm about all this, calm, cool, collected, and that made them think he was going with the God's blessing, etc., etc. And, it's interesting, he would fare well when he got there, if anyone ever does, sort of bringing up the point, well, maybe it is an endless sleep, blah, blah, blah. But so, no feelings of pity. However, there's, laughing, weeping, etc. And then he calls out Apollodorus in sort of a dickheadish way. And then talking about engaging in philosophical discussion as we were accustomed to do. But then, strange feeling, unaccustomed mixture of pleasure and pain at the same time as I reflected he was just about to die. So arguably they're just confused about their feelings, etc., and they're sort of at a loss for being able to process what's going on. So they say, I know Apollodorus, he was quite overcome, but I myself was disturbed, and so were the others, who phaedo were those present. And here's a big paragraph. Among the local people, there was Apollodorus, whom I mentioned, Critobulus and his father, aka Crito, also Hermogenes and Epigenes, Aeschines, and Antisthenes, Ctesippus of Paeania. I'm butchering some of these names, by the way, my fault, but Menexenus, I don't speak Greek, by the way, and some others, but here's the big point. Plato, I believe, was ill, and I have a underline of that and an LOL right next to it, because it's very funny, and we're actually going to circle back to that after they're done basically saying who was there, because spoiler, we're not done with that yet, but one thing I forgot to go over again, anyway, it struck me at Socrates, even in going down to the underworld, he was going with God's blessing. So again, going down to the underworld, again, this puts Socrates is casting him. Remember we said Socrates talks about in 3 days I'll arrive in fertile Thea. If you understand the illusion, Socrates is at least quoting Achilles, if not putting himself in his shoes and comparing himself to him. Therefore, on the Odyssean versus Achillean sort of scale of which hero and which epic are you sort of taking your marching orders from, you would say Socrates was casting himself as more of an Achilles, and I've made the argument, you can make a lot of arguments in that favor. You can make arguments on the other way too. But again, these illusions are all over the place and they're very artfully done. So just to point that out. But then to point out sort of the biggest detail that we've heard this entire time, so there's local people there, Apollodorus, Crito and his father, or Crito and his son, Critobulus, Hermogenes, Epigenes, Aeschines, Antisthenes, Ctesippus, Menexenus, or whoever these people, but important to note, and it's important to note, and I'm not trying to drag this out to make any of you listeners feel stupid at all, I assure you. I mean, I would fucking miss this if I wasn't paying attention, honestly, and if I had it sort of beaten into me the number of times of how important this is to note, and it's just one of those things you'll miss. But Plato, in 5 words, sort of gives the game away when he says, I, Plato, who was present at Socrates' trial, was not present for his death. And clearly, as they've already asked, and as Plato sort of himself is pointing out on the first page, it's not like the state had banned him from having, it's not that the authorities didn't allow them to be present. He died with no friends present. He had plenty of friends around him, but allegedly Plato was ill. Now, and actually, you don't want to be a dick though, because let's go over the reality here. They're putting Plato's friend and mentor to death. That's traumatic. That's terrible. And in addition to that, then you can make the argument Plato sort of best appreciates and understands sort of the scope of what Socrates has been arguing for, and therefore he has sort of the fullest appreciation of what is going on, even more so than the people that are there. But it's just important to note that Plato, he was listed as being present at the apology, and that means he was in court. So it's like, did he catch the flu over the weekend and couldn't be there for when they put him to death? Like, what was the deal with that? And not to say that Plato has kind of a Simon Peter moment where he, denies his master 3 times or whatever, but it's just to put it in context to say this is maybe Plato himself sort of alluding to the fact that now that I'm telling sort of the last story of Plato's life or Socrates' life, going forward, we're going to be getting a little more creative with things. I may be putting my thumb on the scale a little bit more, and maybe there's a slight bit less of fidelity to historicism and facts of, is this actually what Socrates said, did, etc. But that's just to note those things, and to note that you basically don't want to go past the first 2 pages of Phaedo before you realize, oh, okay, this is a different format than the earlier dialogues, quote-unquote earlier dialogues, because frankly, who in the modern world really is to say that Plato wrote these at one time or another? I mean, that's an opinion, but it's an opinion with some thought process behind it, and so we're going to roll with it, because for the most part, we're going to roll with sort of traditional understandings of things until we've sort of refuted those traditional understandings. So to continue, Echecrates says, what about Aristippus and Cleombrotus? Where were they? No, they were said to be in Aegina. Was there anyone else? I think these were all. Well then, what do you say the conversation was about? So, yeah, we are going to stop. We're going to stop right after this page, because this is going to be a good place to end, and then, frankly, the next page or so is going to be a whole sort of, there's going to be a whole episode in itself. So, we'll, and frankly, also, we need to get out of the way some of the casual sort of misogyny that is allegedly at work in this paragraph, but I don't think it's even that Socrates says it now. He only says it later when he basically says, I sent the women out of the room to stop people from crying, but that's way ahead, and I don't need to preview that too much. So just go through this paragraph. So Phaedo is talking about what the conversation was about. I'll try to tell you everything from the beginning. So again, Plato's sort of making every attempt to say, guys, I wasn't fucking there. I'm trying my goddamn best to do my best and take it for what it is. So on the previous days also, I'll try to tell you everything from the beginning. On the previous days also, both the others and I used to visit Socrates. We gathered at daybreak at the court where the trial took place, for it was close to the prison. And each day we used to wait around talking till the prison should open, for it did not open early. When it opened, we used to go in to Socrates, spend most of the day with him. On this day we gathered rather early, because we left the prison on the previous evening. When we left the prison on the previous evening, we were informed that the ship from Delos had arrived, and so we were told each other to come to the usual place as early as possible. When we arrived, the gatekeeper who used to answer our knock came out and told us to wait and not go in until he told us so. The 11, who were the police commissioners of Athens, he said, are freeing Socrates from his bonds and telling him how his death will take place today. After a short time, he came and told us to go in, found Socrates recently released from his chains, and Xanthippe, you know her, sitting by him holding their baby. When she saw, she cried out and said the sort of thing, I hate this, said the sort of thing that women will usually say, Socrates, this is the last time your friends will talk to you and you to them. Socrates looked at Crito. Crito, he said, let someone take her home. Some of Crito's people led her away, lamenting and beating her breast. We're going to continue for 2 more paragraphs here, so we're going to chew on that paragraph a little bit. But to continue, Socrates sat up on the bed, bent his leg, rubbed it with his hand, and as he rubbed it, he said, "What a strange thing that which men call pleasure seems to be, and how astonishing the relation it has with what is thought to be its opposite, namely pain. Man cannot have both at the same time, yet if he pursues and catches the one, he is almost always bound to catch the other also, like two creatures with one head." I think that if Aesop had noticed this, he would have composed a fable that a god wished to reconcile their opposition but could not do so. So he joined their two heads together, and therefore when a man has the one, the other follows later. This seems to be happening to me. My bonds cause pain in my leg, and now pleasure seems to be following. Cebes intervened and said, "By Zeus, yes, Socrates, you did well remind me of Venus. Asked me the day before yesterday, as the others had done before, what induced you to write poetry after you came to the prison? You who had never composed any poetry before, putting the fables of Aesop into verse and composing the hymn to Apollo, if it is of any concern to you that I should have an answer to give to Venus when he repeats his question, as I know he will, tell me what to say to him." So, we're gonna go over this next time, this poetry bit, but just to sort of note something that's seen as important is that Socrates is essentially composing poetry and or music before he's put to death. He who, according to Plato, will in his ideal city banish the poets. So just something interesting sort of take note of, but frankly, no offense, I don't give a shit about poetry, and we're gonna sort of ignore that for now because we'll get there later. Although I'm basically probably gonna read that paragraph at 60D again, but just say again, fables of Aesop, putting them into verse and composing the hymn to Apollo. Again, Socrates seems to worship Apollo, if not solely, it's one of his primary gods, and there can be no doubt about that. So there's two paragraphs here that we're going to focus on for the remainder of this, and I'm already beyond or around 50 minutes, so I don't want to go too much longer. So it's not that important. Socrates' homies' customs of going to the prison. One thing that's interesting to note, for a guy who's in prison, Socrates is allowed to spend an awful lot of fucking time with his friends. Wonder if they let him have a conjugal visit, although his wife is there with a baby, so maybe not. But although the baby is probably not a newborn, it's probably it's a little bit older than that, but that's my speculating. Who knows? All I know is Socrates is 70, so he's 70 and he has a baby. Take that for what it is. He's already got kids and he's got more kids. And then sort of this is where you will get sort of feminist philosophy basically being like, well, there's nothing good in Plato and there's nothing good to be derived because you can clearly see here that everything in Platonic philosophy is an output of a patriarchal sort of ideology, etc., etc., etc. There's no value to be derived from such problematic sources. Therefore, we need to reject it completely and become the robot, whatever the fuck. I've read some bullshit along those lines, and I'm not gonna, because I consider myself a feminist, but in my opinion, certain feminist philosophers go way too far and essentially throw out the baby with the fucking bathwater in these cases. And so I think what's better is to essentially note the sort of nature of the misogyny, to be clear about it, to not make excuses for it, to look it directly in the eye and say that it's a flaw primarily of Socrates' friends, but arguably of Socrates himself, because he says at the end, I sent the women out of the room because I didn't want to hear any crying, although it's sort of the Socratic irony and the Platonic irony theoretically of him saying that sort of, you know, kind of knowing that his friends were likely to do exactly what they were doing in terms of crying all over themselves, etc., etc., etc. But so we have here Phaedo relating the conversation, trying to tell everything from the beginning. So arguably too many details. I don't give a shit about what time you got to the prison and all this stupid shit. And then so important though, Socrates recently released from his chains, and Xanthippe's there. So just to make this 100% clear, Xanthippe is Socrates' wife, mother of his children, and so, you know, frankly, there's just sort of this problematic attitude of arguably Socrates and his homies, but I think certainly of Socrates' homies, where they frankly are like, oh yeah, get her out of the room so we can do philosophy. But, you know, Xanthippe is sort of making note of the real point. This is the last time your friends will talk to you and you to them. And that's sort of one of the only things I guess Socrates can't really refute in this whole process in terms of saying whether or not death is a good or an evil, etc. He can't really deny that once he's gone, he won't be conversing with his friends anymore. And so then Socrates just has somebody take her home, and she's upset. And I mean, to say it's reasonable for her to be upset is a friggin' understatement, because this is where, again, or not again, but because I talked about this a little bit, but to judge Socrates as if you were looking at it from the Christian perspective of, oh, is that person really a saint? And let me troll through the entirety of their lives and try to find the smallest flaw in them, which is indicative of some sort of sinful behavior, and therefore they sinned, and therefore they're not perfect, and therefore they're condemned but for the grace of an almighty God, and blah, 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 blah. And I just don't want to, I don't want to look at it from that sort of extremist moral perspective. I think it is an extremist way if you're frankly looking at somebody like that. So again, we criticize the sort of casualness of the misogyny. We note it, and having noted it, we bring it up in cases where it is relevant. For example, that Socrates doesn't really give a good enough accounting of what will happen with his children and his wife and etc. Like you can say, you know, he didn't answer that, and that's dishonorable, this, that, and the other. Make your arguments for that, and that's what I would say along those lines. But as far as, oh, I'm not going to read anything of it because it so offended me and my ideology from the beginning, you know, trigger warning, I can't read it, it's too traumatic. Like, how about you get over yourself and read one of the great works of human history and stop being a fucking fool. Sorry to let my flag fly there, but I seriously cannot stand the sort of trigger warning sort of ideology that people need to be babied into avoiding things that are going to offend them. Like, obviously you don't want to be just, you know, teaching people, or, you know, teaching a film class by watching that KKK movie unnecessarily or whatever, but certain times you just cannot just blot out all the rest of history because you're not happy with the problematic nature of things. You really have to go more on a Plato style and be more subversive and countercultural with what you're doing, and find your way to do things that otherwise, you know, I just have no patience for it, and I'm not gonna let that trip me up anymore. So that paragraph is what it is, and it's problematic, and we've noted that for long enough. But the next paragraph, again, this is why we read Plato. This is why we do philosophy. And I've said we too many times as if I'm talking to myself, but hopefully this is starting to build a sort of communal aspect of, to some extent, you know, like I feel like when I'm watching Pat McAfee's show and they're all talking, and clearly I'm not talking back to them, but I'm still part of a discussion and still a we in some sense, because I'm participating to the degree that's possible for me. That's kind of what I mean by we. It's the same sort of we when it's, talking about your favorite sports team. No, I'm not on the team, but I'm invested. So, to reread this paragraph again, that is so important, and Socrates will chew on this, so we will get through these ideas over and over, but because it's really the rest of the dialogue is about this, and this is the sort of brilliance of the Platonic style, where it's such a casual sort of throwaway comment of what Socrates says, but it has so much wisdom within it that it can just be unpacked for the rest of the dialogue. So to reread it, Socrates sat up on the bed, bent his leg, and rubbed it with his hand. And as he rubbed, he said, "What a strange thing that which men call pleasure seems to be, and how astonishing the relation it has with what is thought to be its opposite, namely pain. A man cannot have both at the same time, yet if he pursues and catches the one, he is almost always bound to catch the other also, like two creatures with one head. I think that if Aesop had noted this, he would have composed a fable that a god wished to reconcile their opposition but could not do so, so he joined their two heads together, and therefore when a man has the one, the other follows later. This seems to be happening to me. My bonds cause pain in my leg, and now pleasure seems to be following." So we're going to really tear this paragraph apart analysis style, which means the word analysis means to essentially cut something up or subdivide it. And so we're going to subdivide this sentence into its components. We're going to look at it from sort of a assertional perspective, like a propositional logic perspective, and we're going to try to analyze the living hell out of this paragraph. But to first go over the things that I've underlined from this paragraph. What a strange thing that which men call pleasure seems to be, with what is thought to be its opposite, namely pain. When a man has one, the other follows later. My bonds cause pain in my leg, and now pleasure seems to be following. So, again, like I said before, this is sort of the Plato, Socrates sort of tactic of good storytelling, where you use something that can be applied to, broadly speaking, an experience that many people could be familiar with. And that experience that is being invoked in this paragraph is the pleasure of the relief from pain. So I can give an example. I have, discomfort in my left knee, especially when I don't bend it and basically straighten it out. Every once in a while, it just went crack right there, just like I knew it would. And so you can say that, basically what Socrates is saying here is like, I just got the relief from the knee discomfort, and so the discomfort almost causes the pain, or it causes the pleasure in sort of an interesting way, where they follow on each other so closely. And in this dialogue, Plato, through Socrates, will come up with a very sophisticated ideology that, spoiler alert, I think is a load of bullshit, but is very much worthy of consideration. And the basic idea is that these things are truly in relation to each other. They truly do cause each other. Like, it's not a coincidence, basically, that pleasure follows on the absence of pain. And so to give sort of the idea that this is leading to eventually the broad idea from Plato, and I think this is carried through in Epicurus, why I think Epicurus is really a Platonist in a lot of ways, a Platonist sort of in a materialist sort of way. But just to point out that so he says, maybe we'll just do the analysis. A strange thing what men call pleasure seems to be. So it's what pleasure seems to be, rather than saying pleasure is, etc. And astonishing the relation, what is thought to be its opposite. So he's sort of calling into question what pleasure is, what is the opposite of pleasure, a man can't have pleasure and pain at the same time. And so when he says that, that's sort of an implied sort of the influence of a Prodicus on Socrates and others of these thinkers who, maybe this is Parmenides as well, where they were seemingly starting to articulate the principles of non-contradiction, etc., such that you can essentially make the real intellectual arguments against something, saying, well, if I can't have the two at the same time, then clearly they are different from one another if they aren't actually opposites, but they're clearly not the same thing, and I can't have them at the same time. But if you pursue the one and catch it, you're always going to achieve the other. And so the idea that's at play here, and that I think is commonly carried through to Epicurus, and I've come up, like in my reading of Plato, with versions of arguments against this, so we're going to consider kind of a lot of sides to this, but the basic argument is that pleasure actually doesn't exist. So be clear about that. What that means is that what we call pleasure, what seems to be pleasure, is actually simply the absence of pain. And in this case, Socrates is saying the absence of pain after pain is what makes something seem pleasant, etc. And so, there's this difference between pleasure and pain, but Socrates is showing, I think, that they're not quite as different from one another, and that basically, it's taking it to the Epicurus level to say pleasure is nothing in itself, avoidance of pain is the good, and therefore sort of an ideology around the concept of ataraxia, which is a sort of a tranquil mind, a theory of eudaimonia as ataraxia, or a theory of happiness as ataraxia. And I think there's just evidence to suggest that these ideas are at least expressed in Plato. And so you have here just the big point that Socrates is making of, I was just released from my chains, and it's strange because this feels so good, but clearly this wouldn't have happened if I hadn't been chained in the purpose. So then it's kind of like, was it a good thing that I was chained? And I think anybody would say, of course not, Socrates. And therefore, that's what's just interesting from the philosophical perspective, is that Socrates is raising the question to be like, well, we say pleasure and pain are this, and that, but then when we analyze it, it's not what we thought it was. And so then, Socrates is talking about his dreams, and basically the dream tells him to practice and cultivate the arts. And so, so then he starts putting fables together. So we will go through that next time. So just to sort of write that down right now. So this was pod 29. So pod 30 will be starting from 60D in Plato. We'll be continuing Plato's Phaedo. If I do a look ahead really quickly, we're going to do one. So we're going to go next time. 1, 2. We're going to go another 3 pages next time. And by doing that, I think we're going to get some good material and be able to stop before Socrates starts to give the full versions of his proofs, etc. So, want to just stop here. So this is pod 29 of starting Plato's Euthyphro. Again, I just think worthwhile starting Plato's Plato's Phaedo. Mix those up. They're both throughout religion in some sense. Starting Plato's Phaedo here. My favorite Platonic dialogue, and we've sort of seen some of the things that make it my favorite from the beginning, But rest assured, we're gonna get deeper into it as we go along. But just gonna stop here real quick. Seems like a good time to stop. So it's pod 29. Thanks.